Okay, good morning to all of you. I think we are ready to start. And warmly welcome to this utmost, I think, both important and interesting session with the title Inclusive Prevention, Engaging Youth and Civil Society. My name is Sven-Eric Söder, and I'm the Director General of the Folke Bernadotte Academy. And the Folke Bernadotte Academy is the Swedish Agency for Peace, Security and Development. And I'm really pleased that I have been asked to moderate this important panel. And we will get started in a few seconds. But before we do that, I would just say a few words of introduction. Because I do think that when we are discussing important issues, it's also really important that we have high ambitions. And I think at least some of you can agree that you have participated in some panels and seminars over the years. And in the end of the seminar, you are not all the time being convinced or sure what you really have taken away from the discussions. So what I would like to do is that we can have an agreement between us here from the beginning, which means that in your final remarks, it will be very much appreciated if you can present at least one concrete takeaway, action-oriented takeaway, that we can bring back to our respective environments where we are working. A suggestion, how can we push forward the important agenda of youth, peace, and security? And I have no doubt that you are absolutely able to do that, so I think no one here will be disappointed. Let me also introduce our excellent and distinguished panel. And on my right-hand side here, first we have Mr. Graham Simpson. Mr. Simpson is the Director of Interpeace in the United States. And as you know, Interpeace is a global organization, and you have your headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. And for the time being, you are working in at least 20 different conflict and post-conflict zones all around the world. And I think it's also important to notice that Mr. Simpson is the lead author of the UN Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security. Very welcome, Mr. Simpson. On my right-hand side, we have also Mrs. Shuvai Nyoni, who is gender, peace and security expert, and you are currently serving as the Executive Director of the African Leadership Center in Nairobi. And the ALC is a research and training institution that focuses on raising next-generation African leaders, thinkers, but also practitioners within the peace, security, and development sector. You're also very welcome. On my left-hand side, we have Mr. Farea al-Muslimi, who is chairman but also co-founder of the Sana Center for Strategic Studies, which is an independent policy and research think tank that provides new approaches to understanding Yemen and the surrounding region. And just like Mr. Simpson, Mr. al-Muslimi is also part of the advisory group of experts for the Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security. You're also very welcome. Thank you. In the middle here, in the sofa, I have I'm pleased to introduce our fourth panelist, Ms. Thevuni Kotigala. Mrs. Kotigala operates as a program coordinator at Sri Lanka Unites, which is a group that aims to unite youth of all ethnic and religious backgrounds across Sri Lanka to promote reconciliation and lasting peace. You're also very welcome. And last but not least, of course, I have also the pleasure to introduce Mrs. Fatima Maiga, who is the president of the Coalition of Women Leaders from the North, South and Center of Mali. Fatima has a long experience of working with girls and women's empowerment and has previously held a position as country director for UN Women in Côte d'Ivoire. You are all very welcome, and of course, you in the audience, you're also very welcome to this session. I would like to ask each of you in roughly 4 minutes to answer my first questions. And I would like to start by turning to Mr. Simpson. And as I mentioned, you have been the lead author of this impressive, but also, I would say, comprehensive UN Progress Study report on youth, peace and security. Do you think it's possible, just in 4 minutes, to summarize the report and to tell us what you think are the main takeaways and recommendations?
So the short answer is no.
Okay, then I turn to...
So at the risk of using a little bit of my 4 minutes, it's amazing to be on a panel with young people, 2 of whom were on my advisory group, and I'm going to credit the others with being young. I'm fascinated just to see a show of hands of who in the audience is under 30. Okay, amazing, because often there are many fewer hands. When we presented this to the Security Council in an open debate, the report, we set a precedent because we had 4 briefers of the council, myself and 3 young women. And I don't think that's ever happened, all from civil society, and or 2 from civil society, and 1 the Secretary General's envoy. This is very important because when we talk about what the most important things are about this, and I'll talk about the findings and some of the recommendations in a moment, one of the most important things about this was the participatory nature of the exercise. We ran 281 focus groups through partner organizations in civil society who could access, on a trust basis, young people in 44 countries around the world, 27 country case studies, regional consultations in every part of the world. This is really important because the content of this is about young people's perspective and young people's voice. And that's the starting point in filling what I think was recognized in UN Security Council Resolution 2250 when they called for the study, a recognition of exclusion and marginalization of young people at the heart of this. 1.8 billion of the world's population, between 1/4 and 1/3 of them living in situations exposed to ongoing violence, voiceless in the politics, economics, social and cultural arena, or excluded, not voiceless. They have their own voice. So dealing with at the heart of this, that exclusion and the trust deficit that it has produced. Young people don't trust their governments. They don't trust the multilateral system. They increasingly don't trust civil society organizations. And unless we embrace this and recognize that we have to address this through participation that is meaningful for young people, I think we're in real trouble. And I think, so that I think is where the study began its start. The second thing we discovered is that there are real stereotypes about young people. The stereotypical, when you talk about peace and security, the stereotypical image of a youth is a young man with a gun and a young woman consigned to the status of victimhood. And both of these stereotypes completely deny the agency, leadership, mobility of young people as builders of peace. And that was the great asset of the study, is that our mandate was to look at and document young people's contribution to building peace and preventing violence. What we discovered is that there is, and I should just say, these stereotypes have produced really worrisome policy assumptions. The assumption that bulging youth populations necessarily lead to increased violence. The assumption that young people on the move and migrating youth are going to add to infiltration and increased criminality. The assumption that all young people are at risk of joining extremist armed groups. None of this is based on evidence, and our study shows that, and shows that, on the contrary, there is an extraordinary upside of young people invested in peace building. Not all young people, we can't romanticize this. Most young people are getting on with their lives, but there are an amazing group who are working on peace. They've invented sustaining peace because they're working across all the phases of conflict, preventing the outbreak of violence, preventing the escalation of violence, the continuation of violence, and the recurrence of violence. And they're present across all of those phases. They're present from the most local level through at family level and at schools and in communities, right through to global networking. They're working across different types of violence. We were talking to young people in the Caribbean region who are saying, if you only talk about violent extremism, this feels like it's describing a geopolitics that are not the issues that we're dealing with. And we have so much to learn from what we've learned from gangs and other forms of youth violence and our prevention endeavors there. So young people are working in all these areas. And I should say, one of the things we see but may not recognize as the critical contribution of peace building of young people is their role in protest and peaceful dissent. This is so important. So the last thing I want to say is that this ability what we're seeing is that there is an alternative to investing in card security and in risk-based approaches which treat young people as a problem, and instead shifting our focus to investing in the upside, in the resilience of young people. To do that, we have to circumnavigate the exclusion, and we have to include young people politically, economically, through reintegrating former fighters. We need to recognize the gendered nature of this and the particular experiences of young women and deal with masculine identity. We need to think about education. We need to definitely protect the spaces that young people work. So these are critical issues. They present some really seismic challenges to us. How do we move from remedial approaches that are largely security-based to real prevention approaches? How do we move from investing in risk to investing in resilience? How do we think about collaboration and partnership differently so that we're not just talking about member states, we're talking about civil society as well? And on all of these things, this produces a series of recommendations in the report that are about building the capacity, agency, and leadership of young people, addressing these issues of exclusion in all these areas, and lastly, building these kind of global networks and partnerships in order to really invest in youth-led peace building.
It's a really broad agenda, isn't it? Pretty broad.
It is. And, you know, it's interesting because young people said, whatever you do, don't ghettoize us. We are everywhere. Yeah. Don't insulate us into youth areas. Please don't set up ministries of youth that are trying to provide us with sport and recreation. Yes, we can use those things for peace building, but please don't do that. Probably one of the most powerful things I heard is one young person said, we know in the SDGs, there are SDGs that have special relevance to us. Education, employment, SDG 16 in terms of peace, etc., etc. But remember, for us, every SDG is a youth SDG. Make sure we're everywhere. So it has to be complex. It has to be comprehensive. It's very challenging for us. I like to think of it as, you know, we are maybe 25, maybe 100 years behind where a women's movement built momentum like this, recognized exclusion and addressed it. Well, young people are occupying the space and setting the table, not just saying we want to be at your table, but inviting us to theirs.
Thank you, Graham. I would like to turn to Shuvai. And one of the conclusions from the report is that lasting solutions have to be owned and implemented by youth themselves. And I would like to ask you, according to your own experience, what do you see as the key priorities in terms of engaging youth and also stimulating and encouraging youth to reach out and to engage other youths?
Okay, thank you, Sven. And I think I'd like to pick up on the last point that Graham made and your comment about how it is a very complex and vast terrain in which to engage. And I think very importantly to recognize and realize that young people or youth are not a homogeneous group. They are diverse, and especially on the African continent, and you know, because responses and policies are often applied in, you know, as though you are applying it to one block of people, a lump of people. But it depends on where these youth are located physically, geographically, the nature of their development realities, their development needs, their development opportunities, the nature of the situations that they may find themselves in, be they violent, be they you know, political violence, and also what they say they want. So in terms of priorities, I think having said that, we cannot lump them and we must recognize the diversity. I would say there are about 4 sets of priorities that we could look at. The one is, and many of these already Graham has pointed out, but most, I think very importantly, is inclusion and diversity management. So acknowledging that young people exist, that they are not, again, this lump. Young people are in every aspect of life, every aspect of society. And so we cannot, so as much as the agenda may be quite complex, we must do the difficult work of engaging in this complex agenda, and the important work of disaggregating, you know, what we call young people. I think the other issue is inclusion, as I said. Because to not include, and it can't be just a matter of how do we incorporate. It has to be a matter of them being front and center of any kind of development agenda. A second priority, I would say, is leadership, participation, and agency. Young people must be recognized as main actors in governance issues and also in economic matters. And across the continent, we see examples of young people placing a demand on leadership, demanding to be recognized as having agency, and demanding to be involved in governance structures. And they're demanding to be recognized as, number one, again, existing, that they are there, and they're there to stay, that they have a stake in what is being discussed. They're demanding to be recognized that they are setting the agenda. I mean, if we look across the continent of Africa, we see how young people, again, Graham referred to protests, how young people are demanding, fees must fall in South Africa, how young people are demanding to be if you think about the Not Too Young to Run campaign in Nigeria, that young people are placing a demand on what exists to be recognized and to be counted. Young people are running for political office all across the continent, and these are some of the priorities. And young people are no longer satisfied with the response that wait your turn. A priority is for them to be included and to be included now. A third priority, and maybe I'll leave it here for now, for young people is to live well and to live long. So we may refer to it as sustainable development. We may refer to it as the security needs of young people. But it's when we think about it, the majority of young people, at least on the African continent, live in the ungoverned but highly securitized, highly policed areas of the society, but yet those societies are where many of our very lovely policies and normative frameworks don't quite reach. So there is a need to invest in those areas, invest in local economies, not just for the sake of saying we've created jobs and now young people are occupied and they have something to do and will no longer be a nuisance, but in order to provide the opportunities for young people to determine their own futures and be satisfied that they indeed can live well and live long.
Thank you very much, Shuvai. And I think it's interesting that you also emphasize that we are talking about a very diversified group and that the agenda is really, really complex. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we are starting to talk about solutions and the way forward. But I would like to turn to Farea, and you are the expert on Yemen on the panel. So I think it's obvious that I would like to ask you about the situation in Yemen and, of course, in particular, the situation for the young generation.
Sure. I think Yemen is one of the many cases around the world where there is more champions for war than there is for peace. And that's one of the biggest issues we still face as a generation or as societies, is there are still some people who think sometimes war is a solution, despite everything we have gone through history. And Yemen is one of these cases where so many people still think that force can make a difference and that there is a solution in it, or there is something in it, which is a pretty terrifying, I think. But beyond that, within youth overall, I think there has to be first, I am not a big fan of, this is the issues of youth, this is the issues of women. I think there has to be a larger process before that. And then we come talk about these details, because with some minor differences, I think the problems of youth are more or less the same of elderly, the same of women, with some differences, of course, but I think there has to be first a big champions for the peace overall. And then we come into these details. But that's, and this goes back to your question about the war, that's a political decision. Before anything else, peace and youth inclusion is a political decision. It's a political decision that there has to be a decision to be decided for peace in the world, in the region and overall. But most importantly, there has to be budgets for it. There has to be investment, and political decisions means budgetary decisions, means how much do you allocate for youth, as much how do you allocate for weapon industry, for all sorts of things. But let me go back and rephrase your question into what can we learn. I'm not going to talk about youth, but rather from militias, since they seem to be the only thriving and successful groups in the world. And working on within or studying militias, whether in Yemen or in the region, I've noticed at least three lessons learned that I think we should learn from them in matter of youth issues or world peace. First of all, they're very young. If you look to the militias leaders, they are mostly young, from Abdul Malik al-Houthi in Yemen to areas in Africa, contrary to the regimes which are run by very old and boring men, but very old people. You look to Saudi Arabia, you look to Algeria, you look to Yemen, you look to Lebanon, God damn it, Lebanon over 80 years old. And you look to all of, wherever you move really around the region, to Kuwait, you have one of the highest demographics of youth in the world, and you have these places run by elderly who are basically, very hard to explain to them ideas like the Silicon Valley, like, an AQ, all of these sort of stuffs. That's one thing I think the first lesson we should learn from militias is they are run by young people, and that's why they're attractive, they are successful, and that's why they're able to recruit people and to be creative in their work. The second thing is they are very sensitive into local demographics. Contrary to the UN, militias don't go and copy-paste models. They try to study the local complexities in Yemen, which they understand very correctly and dangerously. They understand that it's different from Syria, it's different from Serbia. What might work here doesn't work here. And they have invested a lot of time in trying to understand local complexities and in making different agendas, all the way even from Osama bin Laden, who had a very famous philosophy called centralization of decision, decentralization of executive. So he would say, for example, he would tell the emir in Yemen that I want a bombing. Where, when, how, who is your decision? And that's how they were able to successful. There was this absolute sort of decentralizations, understanding of the local complexities. That this is, and this I think is the second lessons learned we should learn from militia, or from groups in that who are armed groups. Lastly, or before that, I think that what is the biggest threat that is facing whether our region or our youth or anywhere else, I think, yes, we tend to see in the sense of, especially here in Europe, we see refugees, we see ships coming, and yes, that's a brain drain, and that's a money drain of many things. But beyond anything else, that is a hope drain. When someone takes off a ship and jumps for possibly he has no guarantees he will make it alive, that's a hope drain. And that is the most, I think, important or the most dangerous threat our generation is facing, is the absence of hope, and slowly and slowly and slowly. And this isn't just basically in matter of weapons or in matter of areas where there is conflicts. This goes all the way to the United States of America under current circumstances and current leaderships. I mean, how can more you ask the world to be optimistic in that sense if this is how things are going in that way? Now, and the final thing is, when it comes to peace, we usually start thinking about it when wars start or when conflict starts, and that's long a process that I think should be invested before that. I do look into Syria, I do look into Yemen, I do look into Iraq, and there is a war or a conflict that has, of course, dragged a lot of youth. But I think if a violence breaks tomorrow in Baltimore, in the United States of America, there will be even more violence, and there will be even more wars, and there will be more radicalization. And these are issues have to force us into rethink even our understanding of what's a violence and what's a radicalization and what's a problem of youth. I'll stop there, and I think I already took a little bit more of my time. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, and you brought up that many really interesting topics that I hope we can get back to. Thank you very much. Let me turn to Thevuni. We have already, as you have mentioned, or you have noticed, we have already touched upon the women, peace and security agenda also. And I would like to ask you a question about boys and girls. What do you think we can learn from the women, peace and security agenda when we are talking about youth, peace and security? And do you see a need for different approaches towards boys and girls?
Well, I think for that I have a little complicated answer. I think in my head also it's a little complicated whether we need a separate agenda or not. At times I think we need it, at times I think we don't. Because peace and security is an issue that is relevant to everyone. Everyone, regardless of their race, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their gender. So in that case, I think we don't need to put a gender lens, because whatever happens to everyone. You know, like the Afghanistan Minister of Foreign Affairs said very rightly today in the morning, like you can't contain wars, you can't contain conflicts to borders anymore. You know, what happens in one country affects everyone else. For an example, so I'm from Sri Lanka, so our neighboring country is India. So what happens in between India and Pakistan somehow affects us too, even though we are not involved in it. Such a simple example would be when we apply for visa in India, in the application, visa application, they ask whether you have visited Pakistan, whether your grandparent is from Pakistan. You know, this is how we get involved in issues that is, you know, not relevant to us, but completely relevant in one way or another. So in that sense, I think we don't need any lens to talk about peace and security in the world, because it affects all of us. But on the other hand, I also think when we talk about women, peace and security, it's very relevant to, there are intersections in women, peace and security to youth peace and security agenda. Because women get discriminated for just being women, and on the other hand, young people get discriminated for being young. So in this intersection, we have these young women who get double discriminated. You know? So in that sense, we need it too. But also, I think, going back to my previous point, I think genders are not anymore male and female. You know? We are beyond that. We are thinking beyond that now. So in Sri Lanka, for an example, we don't really accept the fact that there are third genders, there are other genders. You know? So in that case, how does security work for them? People get beaten up for being gay, for being lesbians. You know, they get killed for being transgenders. So in that sense, do we still need the women lens to be in the priority? We need to think beyond that. Women are important, but also beyond that. You know? So I think that would be my comment for that. And like Farea also said earlier, this agenda needs to be localized because the contexts are very different to Yemen, to Sri Lanka, to Jamaica, to anywhere else. The context is very different. If you don't understand the context, we are not going to understand how to implement this, how to localize this agenda.
Thank you very much. And I think your conclusion that we are beyond the gender perspective is quite interesting, of course, also worth to discuss. And I think we will do that later on. But let me first turn to Fatima, last but not least, of course. And you are from Mali. And of course, you have your experiences from Mali and that part of your continent. So I think it would be really interesting if you can describe the situation as you see it for young women's participation in the peace process in your country.
Okay, thank you very much. The bad thing of coming last is like your brain is going all over because of the very interesting things that you've heard. The situation in Mali, I think Mali used to be a country that was praised to be very stable and actually the golden poster country for stability. And then, as you know, starting 2012, we fell into this crisis that we are still trying to make sense of, but it shook everything to the fundamentals that we knew, but some things did not change. Some of those were gender relationships, gender norms. And gender does matter so much, especially when we talk about youth engagement or women engagement. When you look at the way female, young women and young boys engage, I can say that they have two different tracks. For men, it could be a much faster track. It's childhood or young adulthood. It's just a transition that would lead most likely to prerogatives, to rights. For most women, young women, it's a track that's extremely slow and usually end up shortened. This has to do with the expectations that are gendered. This has to do with relationship between young men and young women. And that's why sometimes when we talk about engagement, I like to see it from the demand side rather than from the supply side. Supply meaning, is a country endowed with a youth policy? Are there programs for young people? This, for me, it can be more easily fixed than demand. What I mean by demand, my experience with young women, especially in rural parts, and I really want to emphasize what you say is very important. The majority of young people in my country reside in rural parts. And actually, young people composed more than 80% of the population in Mali. So who are they? These are very different people from the elite that actually have access to engagement opportunities. I'm talking to about 10, 15 years old, 35 years old, because age is until 35 years old in my country. Statistics show that not only they reside in rural parts, but they composed 80% of the labor force in agriculture and pastoralism activities. What that means is that they're not engaging maybe in peace building, but they're very much occupied and preoccupied. And the studies show that they're not demanding to participate, for example, in peace as we see it. When we talk to girls, especially in the region of Mafti, which is now the epicenter of the crisis, participation is almost scary because it requires certain competences that they feel they don't have. It requires education. It requires, from their perspective, it requires information from which they are cut off. You want them to talk about disarmament. Well, yes, they have understanding of it, but they feel they don't have the exposure to do the analysis. So they don't feel they can't provide and offer something to the agenda. There's the issue of mixity. In most rural parts, mixity is at your own expense, at your own risks. We do have problems of gender violence. So culturally, young girls are not in an environment that they feel safe to engage with, especially with young women who are more at a leadership level. Then you have some other things that are culturally an obstacle. It's the relationship with adults. The peace process in Mali has been definitely led by 50-something up to 80-something. And my co-panelist said, even though we know the militiamen and some women are definitely within the age range, age group that are defined as group, but they are not decision makers. So they will tell you, those young women we talk with, they say, we're not here to transgress. Our society just defines us. It's a very differentiated and classified and codified. We have to wait for our own turn. We don't see the point of competing with adults who have the situation, who have the rights to be there. So it's very important to work on the demand, as I say, to understand that the obstacles that prevent young women to engage into peace building were existing obstacles before war. They're very structural. They have to do with the expectations, the status and the roles of men and women in the society. And don't expect any programs, especially those that come when a crisis struck, to really get away with these problems. We have analyzed that most of the programs actually don't look at those structural issues. They are on the supply side. They will look at, are women and girls participating in the new PRSP? Are they part of the new policy on disarmament? They will look at numbers, but they're rarely interested in funding those programs that are looking at breaking down barriers to engagement for young women and young boys. So, but I have to say, as the leader of a coalition that I put together, this coalition is made up of women coming from the 3 signatories of the peace agreement. And I have to, when I was invited to this panel, I thought to myself, what am I going to say? Because as someone who's very conscientized about the need for young people to participate, I realized that my coalition has no young women within itself. So there's an issue of accountability on vis-à-vis ourselves also. wanted to say that for the beginning.
Thank you very much,
Okay.
Fatima. Thank you very much. I think all of you, in one or another way, you have touched upon the lack of trust. And of course, it's really, really difficult to figure out where to start in order to foster change on the ground. But I do think that trust is key. So I think it would be interesting to hear from you what you think about the lack of trust and how can we work from governments, from the international community, but also, of course, in established youth organizations in order to foster trust and to give the young generation hope and trust in the established systems that we do have in order to rule the international community, but also, of course, our respective countries. So the question is, what can we do together, NGOs, governments, the international community, in order to build trust among the young generation? Who would like to start on that note?
So I'll jump in and defer to everyone else who knows more about this than me. I talked earlier about the issues of trust, vertical trust, and the issues of the trust deficit between young people and their governments, young people in the multilateral system, etc., etc. The bottom line is, from a prevention point of view, this is a central issue. My view, and I think the key message of the study is, until we counter the violence of exclusion, we will not prevent the violence of extremism. And I think this is a really important message, and I think that is essentially about trust. But what we've heard very loud and clear is that young people are not just saying they don't trust up, they're also saying they aren't trusted from their own governments, etc., etc. And so we need to start seeing this as a reciprocal issue. The second is, it's very easy to work with the usual suspects when we talk about youth. Gathering youth elites, those who speak English, those who are urban-based, etc., etc. And I think what was most powerful in the voice of young people we were consulting is a recognition that they need to listen down and speak up, or listen in and speak out. Let's not make it hierarchical. That within young groups of young people, because they are diverse and fractured and divided and a microcosm of the wider society, relationships need to be built horizontally between young people, that they need to build out, and that this is about building a global youth movement. And lastly, far from there being a disinterest in engaging transgenerationally, young people are incredibly enthusiastic about having conversations with older people, and that the transgenerational and the intergenerational conversations and opportunities at community level, horizontally, is very important. So I think it's really important we start thinking about this trust issue, both as vertical and horizontal, both in society and in the relationship between state and society. And on the last thing, some of this is about political participation and what is meaningful political participation. Young people are saying to us, you know what, inclusion, it's not always a word we like. It sounds like we're being invited into something else, and it's not unconditional. We're not interested in participating and being included in systems of patronage that are corrupt. We're not interested in participating in undemocratic systems. So this is really important. But I think this applies economically as well. What we're seeing is a loss of trust in assumptions about economic benefits that will somehow trickle down to young people, that are not, we talk about giving young people jobs, and young people are saying not just jobs, beyond just jobs. We actually want a stake in the development agenda. We want a stake in the SDGs. We want a stake in a say in what. So I think we need to think about how we build trust in much more complex and integrated ways.
Thank you, Graham. Anyone else who would like to touch on this question?
Oh, just on what Graham was saying, I think you're correct that we trust older people. The problem is they don't trust us. And that creates a more complex issue is how do you invest in the generation? I think worse than that, there is another problem, and I don't have any ideas, but I'm just raising concerns, is we don't trust each other. and that's an increasing phenomena, I think. But it is part, again, not just of a youth thing, it's a part of a trust and faith in the world. And the type of politics and the type of conversations and the type of agendas and priorities happening there can make you one of the most hopeless persons in the world. And this is especially problematic with the flow of data, not information. With the flow of data through online, through new tools that basically makes you exposed to every terrible news and makes you as a person, forget about politics, forget about empowerment, forget about anything, makes you as a person, or risks makes you very cynical of the world.
True. I would also like to make this session interactive. So, of course, we have time for questions from the floor. And I think we have 10, 15 minutes, something like that, for questions from the floor. And I think we have a mic that can be used and circulated in the room here. So just raise your hand, tell us who you are, and please try to be too much to the point as possible when you are putting your questions. So please, don't be shy. Here we are. Please, where is the mic? And there is our friend. Back. Yeah. Back. And then you, yes. So please introduce yourself before you are putting the question. Please.
Yes. Okay. My name is Mutaru Mumuni Mukhtar. I work with the West Africa Center for Counter-Extremism. I just heard you mention, make a comment about the youth in terms of trust. Does that mean that the youth have competing agendas in some situations? And would that imply that the youth in some situations could be actually a distraction or a demotivator for the peace process of building peace in some communities? Because we generally agree that the youth is a catalyst for sustainable peace and development. And if it is a situation that the youth have competing agendas, that might be working against, the general effort towards peace building. Thank you.
So, who volunteers to take that question?
Or maybe we should take more than one.
If you take the first question, I think. No?
No,
Well,
maybe I'm going to try to.
Yeah.
Was the question? Are you questioning the kind of
my
relationship?
Yeah, my question is, does it mean that in your work you find the youth often having competing agendas? If you don't trust each other, why is that? Is it that there are competing agendas that makes you, unable to trust each other? Because we should all be on the same plate. The same, level in terms of the agenda nationally and generally. But if that's not the case, does that mean that there are competing agendas? Does that mean that you could also be a distraction to the peace process or development process?
So your question is that it might be a situation with infighting and different opinions among the young people and the youth organizations. Is that correct?
I can definitely say that there are not angels, and this kind of infeuding competition that you can see in peace, in young-led associations will exist in other associations, coalitions, including those that, for example, the mine, for example. But we don't stigmatize young people. Agenda setting is one of the most difficult aspects. And the reason why I started by saying that it's important to talk about the young people, where the majority of young people are in rural parts. Usually they have been left out in the agenda setting. What are the priorities, especially in places that are directly affected by the crisis for many reasons? Lack of access to those regions, lack of relationship with youth at the community-led level. We see agendas that sometimes, most of the time, don't reflect their issues. I can tell you, for example, for young women and men in Mopti and the northern part of Mali, number one issue, is having the administration, the state coming back into those regions so they can have access to school, they can have access to water, they can have access to health centers. But the way it's presented by those who have a voice, then the priority would definitely be so very different that you see there are not competing agendas, but there are certain agendas that supersede others, because those who can be in the agenda setting process are the ones, are an elite that is different from, for example, from those who are directly affected by the crisis. So it's an issue of representation that we're facing sometimes.
Can I add one very quick dimension to this?
Sure.
I think that what has become most striking to us through the study is a recognition that unless we, I don't want to say create the right platforms, institutional spaces for young people to be active, participatory, meaningful inclusion, because we're not creating them all. Young people are incredibly innovative and creative in forging their own places, their own tables. The occupation of cyberspace and social media is a youth terrain for direct participation with visible horizontal inequality, etc., etc. What's really interesting about this, and I think what became very clear, is that in the absence of avenues for participation and the resourcefulness, the resilience that I've been talking about that we need to invest in as a positive dimension of peace building, this can have a virtuous or it can have a vicious cycle. And I think that we have a choice. There's probably no single factor that drives young people down the more vicious cycle than state responses that are repressive, aggressive, and violently directed at young people, actually. But it's about investing in the upside. And so recognizing that the youth is not a monolith, that young people are at this sort of intersection between positive and negative forms of resilience, but it's investing in the positive resilience and opening that space up, creating and supporting and harnessing those alternatives. I think this is critical.
And I think it's good to actually have a competing agenda. That's called being young. That shouldn't be an issue in any way. It's an important venue even for a progress moving forward. As a matter of fact, I think we have been a little bit sometimes brainwashed by the new international terminologies with an obsession on terms like consensus. And if you have a consensus about something terrible, it doesn't make it good. So actually there has to be something new and something competing in that sense. As a matter of fact, is whether you need a peace or you need a war, you need to start a militia or have a party or a football game, you need youth. And that's the game. And that's what you need to think about. I think we should be on the same process, but not on the same page. In the same process, working for inclusivity, working for peace, but doesn't have to be in any way, and it shouldn't be in any way, has to be on a same page, I think. Especially on this, and that's what creates creativity and the space, is when we are not on the same page, but larger, but rather in the same umbrella.
So the conclusion is, don't be afraid of conflicting views.
Yeah, I think I have to add something to that as well. Like you said about the word consensus, I think the word conflict is also very, because conflict doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing.
Yes.
It's not. It's not. You might have an idea, I might have an idea. Those can be conflicting ideas, but it also means that we are going to bring out the best idea out of it. But I think what people don't understand is the difference in between conflict and violence. If you're using violence to resolve conflict, now that's a problem. I think, like you very rightly said, and I think you brought a very tricky word to the conversation, trust. It's a very broad concept, very 360-degree concept. It's not just young people don't trust governments don't trust young people don't trust UN don't trust young people don't trust each other. So it's a very conflicting situation. So for an example, in Sri Lanka, so for those who don't know the context, so we had a conflict for 30 years, violent conflict for 30 years, which ended up in 2009, so which is almost a decade ago. But did we address the root causes? Did we negotiate? Did we address the problems? No, we just eliminated terrorism completely. So does that mean the root causes are gone? No. So did we address the issues of communities not trusting each other? No, it's still there. So our minds are trained not to trust each other. You know, our minds are trained for that. Because I remember when I was going to school, so I was born to war. I've seen war throughout my life. So we had bombs going off in schools, in public buses, in trains, pretty much everywhere. So the public was trained, specifically, their minds were trained to suspect each other, to watch out for the suspicious one, you know, to watch out for black color bags that's left unattended, you know. So I think I still struggle to get out of that mentality. So when I was coming to Sweden, I had a connecting flight in Istanbul, and I was sitting in a seat and I could see a black color bag unattended next to me. And I just can't get it out of my head. I'm telling my partner, what's his bag? Should we be informing the authorities? I can't see whose bag this is. I can't find the person. So my mind is trained to do that. So did we unlearn our behavior to trust each other? This is the issue.
But to echo your point about conflict, you should never try to stop a conflict. The question is how to channel it. Otherwise, you are going to go against the idea of life and against the idea of a progress and against the idea of moving forward even as a civilization. You're not going to be able to stop it, but rather the idea is how to thoughtfully, comprehensively, and inclusively channel it.
Shuvai, please.
Yeah, just in response to the question and to add to what my fellow panelists have said, I think the idea of, I think we need to interrogate the idea of young people as a barrier or bringing in, you know, as reversing, and I think, you know, bringing a competing agenda. We need to, I would like to introduce the word legitimacy, and who this agenda, who is it legitimate to? The interest, is there mutuality of interest between the young people and the people deciding that this is the peace process or this is the direction we will go in? I think back to the question of trust and the trust deficit. Our leaders, oftentimes leaders and those who have been involved in peace agreements or negotiating peace or keeping the peace, their ideas of how this peace should be kept is not aligned to those who have a big stake or who have a lot to gain or lose from this peace. And so we need to interrogate what we mean by the role of young people in disrupting, you know, a process that is already ongoing. Who has decided? Who has made that decision? Because oftentimes many of these people who have made the decisions have repeatedly behaved in ways to lead to young people not trusting. So the question then for young people is, why should we then invest in these same people who have broken our trust over and over and over again? Thanks.
Thank you, Shuvai. The next question we do have here in the front. Please.
Thank you very much. Before I sort of make my input, I would like to just acknowledge that it's very...
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, I was going to.
Sorry.
If for once a man would allow me to speak. I'm Otilia Anna Maunganidze, and I work for the Institute for Security Studies in Africa.
Thank you.
And what I wanted to acknowledge first before I introduce myself with respect to the panel is it's very rare to have a panel that is as representative as we have before us. So I wanted to acknowledge that first before I introduce myself. I come from a continent where the median age is 19.4, where countries like Niger have a median age of 14.8. So when I hear a conversation about including youth, and I think one of the things that came out from the panel, because there are people who are under 40 on the panel, is not making it about that. So not making it as if there's a room that's there that's occupied to which youth must be allowed access, is oftentimes, even when we do that, we forget, particularly for a continent, the continent that I come from, that the overwhelming majority of the inhabitants of that continent, the people for whom policies are shaped and crafted, for whom practices have to be right, are young people. And often some of those solutions, whatever they may be, are imposed on them without much of their consent. And I'm not talking about when we are negotiating ways to peace or negotiating efforts towards resolving or sustaining a conflict in a way that is not dangerous. even when people go to vote, for example, the majority of people who go to the polls in my country, in countries within my continent, are the minority of those countries. And they make decisions that affect the youth. And my question to the panel then is, what mechanisms can there be that aren't about including youth, but actually about listening to the people of those countries, those continents, and those regions? So not inclusion in that way, where I'm invited into a room, but where the others walk into the room that the youth are in.
Thank you very much. And I think while you are thinking of your answers, I think we can take one more question, last question. Over there, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Mario Aguja. I'm from the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and down in southern Philippines. I would rather ask two important questions. I seem from the region where I came from, Southeast Asia. One is, what are the challenges of engaging young people where, in fact, this generation is actually a generation in transition? Child soldier today, which is young, will become a commander in 5-7 years. An out-of-school youth today may be a trade union leader and working 7 years in the coming days. So it's really difficult to capture them because today they are young, but we all know they will be graduating somewhere in the current time. So how do you deal with the challenges? Second, back home working with rebel groups and others in the peace process. I'm part of the architecture in the peace process. It's basically the thoughts of the young people there that, same but different. They are same young people. They share something, but at the end of the day, it requires, if you do specific programs to help them, you really have to do certain segmentation because they will say we are different. There were exercises, for example, we opened the field of participation. The young people said, no, we don't like to participate in a rotten politics. We just like to organize ourselves, compose our music, and send our music, or just to have a dance. And yet, some of the organizers saying, there's political participation, this and this and that. But their contexts are totally different from each other. And that's why they say same. And how do you deal with that in terms of creating lenses and agenda for different segmentation of young people? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So in, let's say, 5 minutes, the challenge is to answer those questions.
I can
Fatima,
say,
please.
Maybe at least the practitioners have thought about the lifelong approach, so they can capture the soldier when he's a child, and then when he transitions to being a commander. There are supposedly a wide range of approaches that can focus on them, so they are accompanied. For example, DDR, the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. In this specific case, it's supposed to capture those who are at the onset and those who are at almost the end of their career. Now the question is, does it work? To my sister there, I don't know. We've been thinking about this. We talk about endogene solutions, culturally appropriate solutions, where we really look at where from within the solutions, society can evolve into more acceptance of more inclusion of young people and women. But it's such a revolution that needs to take place and that needs to be rooted into the will and the desire of the population itself, that we don't think that it can be influenced from outside. But it's definitely changing structures, changing norms, and so far we haven't been very successful, except in certain cases where laws, for example, quota law in Mali, in my case, has changed dramatically the inclusion of women, for example, because we went from 5% of women at municipal level to 25% of women with one law. So we're still grappling with finding those things that can have triple effect of changing norms that exclude. So, but it's still evolving.
Thank you, Fatima. Please.
Okay, I
Yes.
think in response to the two questions, the first one from Ottilia, how do you gather the information from the spaces? I think an important thing, I mean, I don't have an exact response, but one thing that is really important is to invest in those areas where the ideas are coming. Well, first of all, to acknowledge that young people have ideas. I think across the African continent, at least, we see that there is a frustration from young people with simply giving ideas to the older generation and them taking the credit for those ideas. So there's a need to acknowledge those ideas, but at the same time invest in the areas where those ideas are coming from. One of those areas is academia and research, where there are many young people involved in and engaged in research, but also in innovation and ideation. So there is a need to invest in that financially and in many other ways, many other resources. I think a second thing is that representation. Yes, we've been talking about how it cannot be inclusion just for inclusion's sake, but young people must be represented numerically, much more than they already are. And not just thinking of quotas, but simply to allow young people for their qualifications, their expertise to be represented in various spaces. I think in response to the question of the challenge of dealing with a generation that is in transition, at the African Leadership Center, this is a question that we are very exercised about, and the idea of what does the future look like? What will a future peace look like? And so we are beginning to research that very idea of future people and future peace, recognizing that in 2050, the people who will be sitting in these rooms, sitting around tables, making decisions about peace and security, will need certain tools, will need certain information, will need to have access to certain things. So if I may, I'll invite you also to our panel tomorrow looking at future peace for those who will be here, and we'll be grappling with some of those questions a little bit more.
Thank you very much. Some more comments?
Just so, for example, in the point of the today's fighter future commander, this is one of the biggest issues we will face. In Yemen, for example, we have 2 million children out of school, 500,000 people, children left in this last war. So in 2 years, for example, and this applies in many places, in 2 years you will have a new UN resolution and you will have a peace decision and different parties will sign. How are you going to deal with this problem that was created in the last war but is beyond that war? That is one of the biggest challenges I think we will face on the long term, is things, even when we signed the peace agreement, the harm these wars and conflicts have already done will go for a really long time. In matter of what can be done to listen to people, to these youth, I would say, not just to youth, but to the whole population of the world. Right now, the number one champion in the world for peace, and should be for progress and equality and so on, is the United Nations. Now, at the same time, the United Nations is the most unfair legal system in the world. And that goes beyond youth, that goes beyond the population, that goes beyond countries. And as long as that system is a fraud, as long as the P5 are a fraud, there will always be a feeling of unfairness, a feeling of injustice, and the feeling of no peace, even from the deep inside. I would say that you will listen to the whole world, not just to youth, but to the whole, to the south, to the east, to the west. That's a serious problem. And until we change, this world system in the way it is, everything we will end up doing is a damage control. And the fixing starts from the place that is trying to fix the world, and that's the United Nations, in my opinion.
Thank you, Farea.
Thank you.
And I think that might be the theme for another panel as well.
Another life.
When you have an interesting discussion, the time is running fast. I'm afraid that we have reached the stage for the final remarks. And I would like to kindly remind you of what I said in the beginning. It will be very much appreciated if you can, let's say in 1 minute, give us your takeaway from this panel, and if possible also an action-oriented takeaway that can be used of us in our different environments when we are working on the youth and peace and security agenda. So this time let's start with Fatima, please.
As I said, look at the demand, look at the reasons why young women in particular do want or do not want to engage. Look at the factors that are structural that keep them in a place where they don't see interest and or they don't see the space. Invest in structural programs, give them time for doing it, build their competences, put them in contact with those who are preventing them from accessing it. Don't put them in corridors. What would I say? Let's also be accountable by promoting participation. Let's make sure that we don't create an elite and we think about the mass of the young people who need to have a voice. It's very important to start preaching, acting on our own values and belief of not creating more marginalization as we try to engage young people.
Thank you, Fatima. Many excellent ideas. Thevuni, please.
I think my key takeaway would be for everyone. It's very doable for everyone in the audience as well. The resolution itself has one of its pillars is partnerships, and I really believe in that pillar because it's very simple. It's very doable. Build partnerships among each other, among the person who's sitting next to you, so that we can go to this one goal of sustainable peace. In Sri Lanka itself, what we try to do is we have a coalition in Sri Lanka for youth, peace and security agenda. So we have UN agencies, youth-led movements, NGOs, INGOs, grassroots level. So we have zero funding. Absolutely nothing. But we put out our own personal money, our own expertise, resources. Whoever has resources, whoever has expertise, we just put it out there. And together we are really building this very strong coalition where we are supporting each other's agendas. We are not trying to have an isolated agenda of trying to achieve sustainable peace by all by ourselves. I'm trying to support someone else's organization along with their own agendas. I think during the process, we've also learned to leave our organizational egos, organizational agendas behind, and to really focus on one sustainable solution. So supporting each other really means something. So my key takeaway would be make partnerships, go for it.
Partnerships, that's key.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can
Farea,
I give
please.
a don't instead of takeaway? Don't take away. So, for example, one I think a big issue is always all peace processes, all peace envoys, whether Yemen or the region or Syria or Libya, are always in a hurry, always in a rush. And I would say if you are ever working on peace, take your time. It takes one bullet to start a civil war, and one bullet takes less than a second. But it actually can take a lifetime to end the consequences of these bullets. Usually all UN agencies, all your peace envoys are in a hurry to deliver. There is an obsession of delivery to deliver to the bosses to make a progress. And usually this has ruined things. In fact, sometimes made them worse. Peace, contrary to war, takes time, a lot of time. And that's something we should always keep in mind.
So take your time. Okay. Shuvai.
I think one takeaway is that let's stop thinking about inclusion. Young people are not coming. They have arrived. They are not demanding a seat at the table. They have taken the table. If we don't recognize that, we continue to run after, a ship that has sailed. And so invest in young people because it's an investment in the future.
Thank you.
So the one that I think has been mentioned that I would really support is to think differently about partnerships and collaboration. So we've been quite deliberate in not being prescriptive about national action plans, which tend very often, not always, but very often to be very top-down, and actually start saying we need to think about coalitions of partners in developing these sorts of plans for addressing the problems. The second is in relation to that, let's stop talking about measurement of progress by reference to standards that are set by donors from the outside and start and continue this exercise of participatory process in saying young people in each country, in each context, need to say what is meaningful progress for them, so that indicators and targets are set by young people, not by outsiders. The third is, I think we've heard a lot about this issue of leadership and the support of leadership. I think working with youth-led organizations is very important, but also recognizing organic leadership of young people is everywhere. And we need to start thinking about this. You know, in community police relations, young people are on both sides of that divide, and we somehow don't think about that. But how do we make a community policing model or a security sector reform approach youth-centric because of this? And the last thing is that we need to fund this. You know, our proposal is frankly modest and going to be terrifying. Spend $1 on a young person over the next 7 years. That's a $1.8 billion youth peacebuilding trust fund. It sounds large until you start comparing it with how much we're spending on arms. The last thing I'd want to say about this, and I think this is really very practical, it's do all of this with a very careful do no harm approach. Because we can throw money at these problems and we can bureaucratize and professionalize the very life out of the resourceful resilience, creativity of youth peacebuilding that we're trying to nurture, support, because it's there. We can kill voluntarism, which is so important. We can start thinking about scaling up and kill the highly localized, trust-based engagements that young people have. It doesn't mean we should be allergic to these things, but be really careful. And lastly, we can start creating measurement regimes that disincentivize the innovation and risk-taking that is the heart of youth-based peacebuilding. So this do-no-harm approach to all of these things is a very practical and concrete condition.
Thank you very much, Graham. I think we have had an excellent discussion, and I think all of you also really have fulfilled all our expectations. I think we got a lot of very practical, handy ideas and takeaways in your final remarks. And I would also like to thank you for coming here and putting your questions to this, as was rightly pointed out, a very representative panel. So please join me in a big hand as thanks to our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.